April 26, 1865. The Mississippi River, somewhere south of Memphis, Tennessee. The night air was thick and warm, carrying the particular softness that only comes to the American South in late spring, when the land has finally shaken loose the grip of winter and breathed itself open again. On the wide, dark water, a steamboat moved steadily northward, her smokestacks casting orange light against the low clouds, her great paddle wheel churning the river into white foam behind her. Her name was the Sultana. She was not a remarkable vessel. She had been built in Cincinnati in 1863, a sidewheel steamboat of the kind that worked the great rivers of the American heartland, moving cotton and cargo and passengers from one world to another. She was 260 feet long, with a legal capacity of 376 passengers and crew. On this particular night, she carried nearly 2,400 souls. Most of them were soldiers, young men, gaunt and hollow-eyed, coming home from the worst years of their lives. The Civil War had ended just 2 weeks before. General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on the 9th of April. President Lincoln had been shot on the 14th and died on the 15th. The nation was somewhere between grief and relief, uncertain of what peace actually felt like after 4 years of learning to live with the sound of cannon fire. And now these men, these Union soldiers who had endured Confederate prison camps at places like Cahaba and Andersonville, were finally making their way home. The Sultana was supposed to be their last journey. Instead, she became something else entirely. To understand what happened on the river that April night, you have to understand what these men had already survived. Many of them had spent months, some of them more than a year, in Confederate prisoner of war camps. Andersonville, in Georgia, was perhaps the most notorious. It had been designed for 10,000 prisoners and held at its peak more than 32,000. Men died there of dysentery and scurvy and simple starvation. They died of despair. They died because the Confederacy, stretched to its breaking point, could no longer feed its own armies, let alone the men it had captured. Cahaba in Alabama was smaller, but no less brutal in its own way. A compound designed for 500 men eventually held more than 3,000. The prisoners slept in shifts because there was not enough floor space for all of them to lie down at once. When the Alabama River flooded in the spring of 1865, the water rose inside the stockade, and the men stood on whatever they could find, knee-deep in cold, filthy water, for days. These were the men who came to the docks at Vicksburg, Mississippi, in late April of 1865. They were thin in a way that went deeper than the body, a thinness that seemed to come from somewhere inside them, from months of uncertainty and hunger and watching other men die. Many of them were still sick, some could barely walk, but they were alive, and they were going home. And the word home had taken on a weight and a sweetness that it never quite has for people who have never been truly far from it. The Sultana arrived at Vicksburg on the 24th of April, 1865. She was already carrying a modest number of passengers and a cargo that included 125 hogsheads of sugar and 60 cases of wine. The steamboat business was competitive, and the war had made it more so. Federal contracts to transport paroled prisoners northward were valuable, and the officers responsible for assigning soldiers to vessels had considerable power over which companies prospered. The Sultana's captain was a man named James Cass Mason. He was 36 years old, part owner of the vessel, and deeply aware that the contracts being negotiated at Vicksburg that April could make or break his enterprise. He needed passengers. He needed as many as he could carry. The Army officers in charge of processing the prisoners were not always careful men. There were later allegations of bribery, of corners cut, of paperwork arranged to send soldiers to the Sultana rather than to the other vessels waiting in port. The full truth of those arrangements was never entirely untangled. What is clear is that by the time the Sultana was ready to depart, she carried a number of human beings that no steamboat was designed to hold. There was also a problem with one of her boilers. The Sultana had 4 boilers, and one of them had developed a crack. A repair was attempted at Vicksburg, a patch of metal applied to the damaged section. The engineer who performed the work later said the patch was not adequate, that the boiler needed more extensive attention. He was not given more time. The Sultana was on a schedule, and the schedule mattered more than caution. The boat pulled away from Vicksburg and moved upstream into the night. The men aboard were in various states of exhaustion and cautious relief. Some of them wrote letters home by candlelight, announcing their survival, promising their arrival. Some of them slept in every available space, the decks, the stairwells, the cargo hold. The boat rode so low in the water from the weight of her passengers that the paddle wheel threw spray up onto the lowest deck when the river ran a little rough. The Mississippi in April of 1865 was running high. Spring floods had swollen the river far beyond its normal banks, and the current was strong. The Sultana had to work hard, her engines straining against the water, her boilers maintaining the pressure needed to keep the paddle wheel turning at a useful pace. She stopped at Memphis in the evening of the 26th. Some passengers disembarked. A few boarded. The Sultana took on a supply of coal and continued upriver into the night. By 2 o'clock in the morning of April 27th, she was about 7 miles above Memphis, moving through a stretch of river where the flooding had spread the water across the lowland countryside on both sides, turning fields and forests into shallow, dark sea. The night was moonless. The water and the sky were nearly the same shade of black.
At approximately 2 o'clock and 10 minutes in the morning, the 3 forward boilers of the Sultana exploded. The sound carried for miles. People in Memphis, more than 7 miles downstream, heard it. People sleeping in farmhouses on the river's edge, their homes now surrounded by floodwater, were startled awake by a thunder that did not belong to the sky. The explosion tore through the center of the Sultana with a force that the survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. The middle of the boat simply disappeared, replaced by fire and steam and the terrible sound of wood and metal failing all at once. The upper decks, where hundreds of men had been sleeping, collapsed into the space below. Men who had survived Andersonville, who had survived Cahaba, who had survived years of war, were thrown into the dark and flooding Mississippi River in the middle of the night.
The water was cold, the current was strong, the river in flood was wide, and the nearest dry land was far beyond what most men, even healthy men, could swim. These were not healthy men. They were survivors of prison camps, still weak, still recovering, many of them sick. They went into the water in their sleeping clothes, without life preservers, without warning, in the dark. The Sultana burned for hours. The fire lit the river for some distance, and it was by that firelight that rescuers began to arrive. Memphis sent boats out into the darkness. People on the river's edge called out to swimmers. Soldiers who had made it to the flooded trees along the bank clung to branches and called for help. Of the approximately 2,400 people aboard the Sultana, somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 perished. The precise number was never established with certainty because the records of who had boarded were incomplete. Whole manifests had been hastily assembled, names misspelled, soldiers misidentified. Some of the dead were never found. The river carried them away into the spring flooding and gave them no grave that could be marked. The Sultana disaster claimed more lives than the sinking of the Titanic, which would come 47 years later and become one of the most examined maritime tragedies in history. Yet most people who are not Civil War historians have never heard of the Sultana. She sank into obscurity almost as quickly as she sank into the river. The reasons for this are not difficult to understand, though they carry a particular sadness of their own. The nation in late April and early May of 1865 was overwhelmed with news. Lincoln had just been assassinated.
The manhunt for John Wilkes Booth was still unfolding. Booth himself would be killed on April 26th, the same day the Sultana left Memphis, and that story consumed the newspapers. Then there was the formal end of Confederate resistance to attend to, the complicated questions of Reconstruction and reunion, the enormous work of accounting for 4 years of war's damage to a country. The sinking of a steamboat, even one carrying so many lives, was simply swallowed by the larger noise of history.
The survivors went home. Many of them recovered from their physical wounds, though the losses they had accumulated, the prison camps, the disaster, the war itself, were not the kind of wounds that fully closed. They married, raised children, worked farms and shops and trades. Some of them spent years trying to bring attention to what had happened, advocating for investigations, writing letters to newspapers, gathering for reunions that grew smaller with each passing decade. One of those survivors was a private named Chester Berry, who had been a prisoner at Andersonville. He published an account of the disaster in 1892, collecting testimonies from other survivors. He wanted the story told. He wanted the men who died to be remembered. He wanted people to know that this had happened, that on a dark spring night on the Mississippi River, more than 1,500 men who had already given so much did not make it home.
There is something in the Sultana's story that lingers long after the facts are absorbed, something that cannot quite be contained in the numbers, in the legal capacity versus actual capacity, in the cracked boiler and the inadequate patch, in the high water and the dark night. It is the particular sadness of men who had already survived the unsurvivable, who had looked at war and prison and starvation and somehow remained, and who were at that moment so close to home that they had already begun to imagine it in detail, the specific smell of a particular kitchen, the sound of a voice calling their name in a yard they had been dreaming of for years. They were not asking for much in those final hours, only the thing that the war had delayed, the ordinary life that ordinary people live. They wanted to go home. They had earned that wanting in ways that are difficult to fully imagine from this distance. The river kept moving after the fire died. The Mississippi does not pause for grief. It carries everything forward, the living and the dead alike, southward toward the sea. And in the spring flooding, in the wide, dark water, the names of those men went with it. But they were there. They existed. They survived the worst years their country had ever known, and they were going home. Their names are not all recorded. Their faces are not all photographed. Many of them belong to that vast, uncountable company of ordinary people who moved through history without leaving the kind of traces that histories are usually made of. But they were real. Their hunger was real. Their relief on those final nights aboard the Sultana was real. And the grief of those who waited for them, wives and mothers and fathers and children who stood at the door watching the road and eventually stopped watching. That grief was as real as any grief that history has thought to record. It is late now, and the world is quiet. Somewhere a river is moving through the dark, carrying whatever it carries, indifferent and patient and old. The stories of the dead travel with it, alongside the stories of the living, all of them moving together towards somewhere none of us can quite see. The men of the Sultana were going home, and in the ways that matter most, the ways that resist the erosion of time, perhaps they arrived there after all. Let them rest tonight. Let the river be gentle with them. And let yourself rest too.